Rock Talk. I'm very excited to welcome everyone to the 2024 Rock Talk series, and the first series that I am serving as Executive Director at the Shoals Marine Lab. For those of you who are joining us online and who may be new to our community, the Shoals Marine Lab is the oldest and largest marine lab in the country that is focused on undergraduate training, both in coursework and in research. The lab is operated jointly by the University of New Hampshire and by Cornell University. Our seminars are affectionately called Rock Talks, in part because back in the early days, many of the seminars and lectures, instead of being done in a classroom, were literally done on the rocks in the intertidal. We've migrated indoors now, but these weekly seminars provide a wonderful opportunity for our island community to come together and learn about new and emerging research topics related to marine science and to hear from some of the people directly connected with the lab. In addition to the guests that are joining us online, in the room this evening, we have many of our staff members, and I love seeing them all here to support our Rock Talker. We have our field ornithology class that is currently on island. It's a 2-week course that's focused on the biology, ecology, and behavior of the local land birds and seabirds and how we study them. And we're also hosting members of the Appledore Island Migration Station who are contributing to the long-term study of bird migration and stopover ecology. We're excited to have everyone joining us both in person and online this evening. The format of tonight's seminar will be a 45-minute talk followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. For our friends online, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll read your questions online out loud for the entire audience. For those of you in the Commons, we'll pass around a microphone, this microphone, for you to be able to speak so everyone can hear you, including the people in Zoom land. Tonight's speaker is our very own Dr. Liz Craig. Dr. Elizabeth Craig joined the Shoals community after completing her PhD in zoology and wildlife conservation and a postdoc in natural resources at Cornell University. She's an ornithologist who specializes in conservation management, population dynamics, and foraging ecology of seabirds. She's authored numerous publications about seabirds in such journals as the Journal of Avian Ecology and Conservation, Marine Pollution Bulletin, Endangered Species Research, and the Wildlife Society Bulletin. She's served as a faculty fellow of the New Hampshire Sea Grant, an affiliate faculty at the University of New Hampshire's Department of Biological Sciences, a PI or co-PI on numerous grants in support of the study of seabirds, and has served as the co-chair of the Diversity Committee and currently serves as the co-chair of Grants Community for the Waterbird Society. She has taught topics ranging from ornithology and aquatic animal diversity to natural resource ethics at Columbia, Cornell, and the University of New Hampshire. Liz now directs the Isles of Shoals Seabird Ecology and Conservation Program and serves as an academic coordinator on the Shoals Marine Lab team. She will be talking this evening on a bird's eye view of a changing Gulf of Maine, insights from the Isles of Shoals Seabird Ecology and Conservation Program. It is my genuine pleasure to invite Dr. Liz Craig as our first Rock Talker.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. That was a lovely introduction. So can you folks hear me? And folks in Zoom world, can folks hear? Yes. Okay, great. Well, again, thank you for having me as the first Rock Talker of the season. I know I'm short. I'll try to see over the computer here for folks in the room. This is actually my first ever Rock Talk in person on Appledore. I've been attending on Zoom for going on 9 years, and I'm very appreciative that they let me off White Island for the night to come here, and also very honored to have been invited to give this seminar. So for folks who are here taking the field ornithology class, I'm super excited to meet you, and I'm happy to see folks online as well. I can't see you, but I know there are people monitoring the chat. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm a seabird researcher here. That's the hat I wear in the summertime. And the rest of the year, I'm working with the academic team to help get all of you guys out here onto the island. So I'm also the Liz Craig from the many emails for any of you who are not actually from Cornell. So it's lovely to meet you. All right, so I'm going to jump in. And so tonight I want to share with you all a lot about seabird ecology and conservation. We'll focus a bit on the natural history of terns as it relates to conservation issues and management opportunities. I'll offer you some research highlights from students, and particularly undergraduate students, and opportunities for folks like yourselves as undergraduates to get involved. Okay. All right. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm directing the Isles of Shoals Seabird Ecology and Conservation Program, which is one of the research programs here at Shoals Marine Lab. Our team currently consists of about 20 students and research collaborators, and we're applying insights from seabird ecology generally to identify conservation challenges and to guide management action. And all of this is in the context of an exciting and interesting and changing Gulf of Maine. So I have here an assemblage of photos that kind of represents the assemblage of waterbirds and seabirds nesting on the Isles of Shoals. It's missing a few, but it's got the major, certainly ecological types. And yeah, so I know I have some birders in the crew. I was going to identify some, but can somebody help me with some of the species that we have up here? Yeah, shout them out and I'll repeat them for Zoom. Okay, a guillemot, that's on the lower right-hand side. That's a diving seabird. A common eider, also another diving seabird, although not eating live fish like the guillemot does. Keep going. There's a great blackback gull. We all know the great blackback gulls and love them here on Appledore. More. Glossy ibis. And who's on the bottom? Great egrets. So some long-legged wading birds. How about top right? It's a tern. Yeah. Okay. So in addition to having this diversity, these birds are they're diverse in a number of ways, not just taxonomically, but also in terms of their natural history and ecology. So some of these are, some birds are specialists on a particular fish species. Some of them are reliant on coastal marshes or rivers for foraging habitat. Others are generalist predators and scavengers. So having this diversity of seabird ecologies all here in one place allows us to explore how different seabirds how their populations are susceptible or perhaps resilient in the face of environmental change, and in that way better understand some of the mechanisms of environmental change in the context, again, of our Gulf of Maine. So that's what we're doing with seabird ecology, and I want to start by acknowledging, feel free to please read every name on this list. I won't have time to read them all, but I wanted to highlight in the 9 summers that I've been working so far, the seabird technicians, the students, and the collaborators who I've been working with. And I've extra highlighted the students who are working with us this summer. So I absolutely want to thank the students who are currently and will be working with us this summer for their dedication and hard work. And hopefully this demonstrates to some extent the impact that our program is having on students. Certainly they contribute tremendously. Our research program is largely student driven, and you can tell based on just the sheer number of students who've been involved. And also I want to acknowledge the really phenomenal community of partners and funding agencies. And I want to particularly thank New Hampshire Fish and Game, since we'll largely be talking about terns tonight. They've championed tern conservation in the state of New Hampshire for nearly 3 decades. Okay. So why are we particularly interested in seabird conservation? Of the 350 seabird species, and as I mentioned, they're taxonomically very diverse. This is just a group of birds that relies on marine resources, so they share this common ecology. Almost half of those birds are known or suspected to be experiencing population declines, so everyone who's not green in this pie. That makes seabirds the most threatened group of birds on Earth. And I think I can do this hybrid style. I'd love to talk with you guys a little bit about why you think seabirds in particular are threatened. Why is this group of bird the most threatened group on Earth? What do you guys think? And I will repeat it for folks on Zoom. Yes. Climate change. What specifically about climate change? sea level rise is a major issue for animals that nest on shorelines and marshes and beaches. Those are areas that are degraded first and habitat lost.
Match with prey species.
Yes, mismatch with prey species. So with changing climate, with warming waters, changes in the timing of seasonal shifts, changes in the timing of phenology, we can see a mismatch between, let's say, the fish in the ocean, the timing of their spawning, when they're here, when they're the right size for a little seabird to consume, and the time when the seabirds really need to eat them. Yeah, and that's a critical issue with climate change. What else? Move on from climate change, maybe. Go ahead and shout out, yeah. Okay, pollution. So seabirds, ooh, birds. So seabirds are oftentimes top predators in their environments, and so they are, especially for biomagnifying toxins, they are getting a pretty high dose being at the top of the food web, and they also reflect what's going on throughout the food web. So absolutely, pollution is a major issue. What else? Overfishing, diminishing resources. So seabirds, especially the birds that we're going to be talking about tonight, eat fish. And a lot of the times it's the same fish that are commercially important in our region. So our terns here love to eat hake and herring and haddock and pollock, and you'll see all those on the menu too. So we have a shared interest in these fish species, but it also means that there is potentially a conflict between the needs of the birds and our own economy. Human development of coastal land. So habitat development, particularly in coastal areas, is a major issue for any animal that lives in an estuary or along the coast. And so certainly these birds need to be near water in order to access the water and also have land on which to breed. They are immediately impacted by habitat loss from development of coastal areas. So you guys hit the major ones that I wanted you to hit, and you didn't you didn't even stray from it, which is incredible. It's also not terribly surprising because these are the really big conservation threats for biodiversity worldwide. So seabirds are experiencing them in their own particular special fashion, but these issues are global, they're universal. That makes them a bit scary and daunting, obviously, especially if you're in the shoes of someone who's responsible and interested and cares about conservation. But they also are specifically the opportunities that we have to make a difference. The better we can understand how animals are interacting with these threats, the better we can design management interventions that might make a difference. And so it's these threats and all the other little ones down the line that inspire a lot of the applied ecology work that we do. And we're also involved in management in a lot of cases. So we're able to act on a lot of the information that we learn through our research. Okay. So we've been, and I say we because I said there's 20 of us even just right now working on this project. We've been conducting research and monitoring on every species on this list. But tonight I'm going to focus on terns because they are the most threatened and endangered species that we have here on the Isles of Shoals. And it's also what I came here to Shoals Marine Lab in the beginning to do and continue to spend most of my time working on. So I'd love to mostly talk to you about terns for the rest of this evening. So we're going to be focusing on this set of threatened and endangered species. I already know that folks in this room can identify them. We have common terns, roseate terns, and a small number of Arctic terns that do breed in the Isles of Shoals. And to put you in a geographic context, folks on the island and probably everybody on the Zoom also knows where Appledore Island is, but for folks in the room, we're sitting right here. And the work that I'm going to be describing is, so we're on the main side of this border in the Isles of Shoals, and I'm going to be talking about work that we're doing over in New Hampshire on White and Seavey Islands. So the project I'm going to describe, this predates me. This is a long-term restoration and management project. I'm going to talk a bit about, as I mentioned, the natural history and the research that we're doing. But there is, as I mentioned, long-term management and monitoring that I won't get into all that much tonight. But that is the key to this conservation project, is implementing restoration management and research regarding these species of terns. Okay. So on to some natural history to start, because I mentioned we're using insights from the natural history and ecology of these birds to better understand their conservation threats and shape management actions. So I want to start with natural history because it's important, and you can't really take an animal out of that context. So I mentioned these 3 species. They've got varying degrees of conservation status. All 3 species are long-lived. These are, in the bird world, maybe 20 to 30 years is a long-lived bird. These birds can live that long, and they're highly philopatric. That's a bit of scientific jargon. That means they have high site fidelity, high site specificity. In this case, these are birds that come back and breed at the same location year after year after year. And oftentimes it's the location where they were hatched. And so it's super helpful to know that about this guild of animals. Seabirds in general are generally highly philopatric. And that means if we know where they're nesting now, likelihood is they're going to come back to those locations in the future. And that makes identifying and protecting habitats that are critical for nesting a little bit easier, which we thank them for. They're highly defensive of their nesting habitats. So I imagine you have all experienced that with the gulls here on Appledore. The gulls are close cousins to terns. They were all in the same family. These birds are about 1/10 the size of a gull, but they also exist. I don't know, it might be 10 times the density. So the aggression that you experience as an intruder in a seabird colony, in a tern colony, is really quite intense. And they do that to us researchers. They do it to predators. They're highly defensive, dive bombing, pooping on you just like the gulls. And we take great advantage of getting pooped on by terns by collecting feces and using it in lots of different research contexts, which I'll mention a little bit later. It's the best part about getting pooped on by a bird. And these birds all rely on small fish for the most part to feed themselves and to feed their young. One of the interesting aspects about their natural history that's different from gulls is that these are really long distance migrants. Terns are some of the longest distance migrants in the world, and the Arctic tern has the superlative longest distance migration of any animal, as much as 60,000 miles in a year, which, if you want to put that in context, that's farther than the circumference of the Earth. Common terns, this is some common term data from a graduate student, Alia Caldwell, who I'll talk a bit more about later. These are graphs from a project that she's working on. And you can see on the left is a map of a common tern. And we're watching it through its full annual cycle from GPS data that we've collected from this animal. So these are long distance migrants, much longer than any of the cormorants or gulls or any of the birds that are living and breeding here on the Isles of Shoals. And that's relevant in terms of local conservation issues because there it did its spring migration. The spring migration of this bird started on May 10th of this year, was 2022. So by May 10th, when this bird is still in here, it's in northern Brazil. The gulls on Appledore already are defending territories and have nests. The cormorants already have laid eggs. All these birds that are competing with terns for physical space, for nesting space, are already here establishing their territories. And terns are still long far away, maybe not showing up until mid to late May to establish territory. And so this makes this species and terns in general in our region management dependent. They rely on managers like us to reserve space for them to breed that's free of competitive gulls and cormorants. Otherwise, there would be no place for them to nest here. And so that is one of the aspects of management that we commit to. But this data is pretty amazing. Okay, so moving on. The last thing I want to mention about the natural history of terns, I'm going to play a short video about the breeding behavior of these birds. And hopefully folks on Zoom can hear, and I can turn that down. That is actually how loud it is. Okay, so for the ornithology class, you guys are going to be able to come out and hopefully experience what it's like to be on a colony. That was an aggressive display by these birds. But I wanted to show you, so this is a typical nesting environment that both common and Arctic terns enjoy. Large open spaces with interspersed cover to protect the chicks. These birds lay 2 to 3 eggs in a clutch, and those clutches are incubated by both the male and female. And when the chicks hatch, both the male and female also help to provision the chick with whole fish. So you can see these are really precocial chicks. They're within 1 day, they're fluffed up, eyes open and walking around. And what you're seeing here with this chick being fed a whole fish by its parent is what does distinguish them from gulls in another way. Gulls regurgitate for their young. These terns have to find the right size fish to feed their chicks. And this is where that comment about match and mismatch really comes in. They have to be able to find a fish that's big enough for their chick to grow, to keep up with the energetic needs of that animal, but also it needs to be the right shape and small enough that it can actually swallow that fish. And so there are a lot of constraints on the foraging behaviors of these terns. They can only travel so far away from the colony to get that fish in order for it to be efficient and bring it back to the chick. They can only forage within about 1 meter of water. And so they're limited to just the fish that are in those shallowest portions of the water column. And as I mentioned, they can only feed their chicks a fish that's the right size and shape. So you can imagine that shifts in the phenology of spawning of fish, or let's say shifts in temperature that made fish go deeper into the water column or travel further north to find a comfortable thermal zone, might shift those high quality prey items outside of the foraging range of these species, which is why they're particularly sensitive to changes in fish communities. And that link directly back to climate. Okay, so I'm going to move on to talk about some of the research highlights. So as I mentioned before, the TERN project has an extensive restoration, management, and monitoring history, which I won't have time to talk about tonight, but hopefully we will be able to talk about it with the ornithology students certainly later. Tonight I want to focus on research and particularly, as I mentioned, like the applied research to conservation issues that we've already discussed. So advancing. So our group poses research questions that apply to that holistic set of conservation threats that we already talked about, as well as I mentioned all the smaller threats that the birds on the colony that we're managing encounter. I'm gonna share with you some stories across these areas, but I want to start by talking about our primary research area, which is diet and foraging behavior of seabirds. It's certainly my background, and so that's one of the reasons that we focus on it a lot, but it's also ecologically probably one of the most important things we can study, as the ability of these birds to provision for their young is oftentimes a limiting factor in their reproductive success. We know this from our long-term monitoring of diet, which I'll discuss a little bit today. So we know this is important. We know it's changing. This is something we spent a lot of time, and our students spend a lot of time studying. So why study diet if not for the birds? As I mentioned for the comment about pollutants, these birds are top predators. They are apex predators in marine environments. That means, of course, those bioaccumulating toxins do reach them at high doses, but it also means that they are generally a very good indicator of what's going on in the ocean and in ocean health. From that perspective, they can tell us and they can teach us a lot about fish in the ocean that are otherwise kind of hard to study, particularly those really small age classes of fish that fisheries scientists have a lot of trouble studying. These birds do it professionally. All they do all day is go out and trap and capture those tiny little fish. And so we can learn a lot by observing what they're bringing back to feed their young. It can tell us a lot about the conditions of commercially important fish stocks, which is valuable to us. It's valuable to fisheries scientists and managers. And of course, we need to understand what the needs are of these birds in order to protect them. If we want to be able to, let's say, make an argument for including the needs of seabirds in fisheries management planning. So how do we study the diet of terns? Luckily, as you guys saw in that video, these birds are bringing back whole fish, which means that if you're one of those lucky few folks who's able to sit on a seabird colony with binoculars for any amount of time, you'll see these birds flying through the air with fish. And they're carrying those fish back to feed their chicks. And if you are sitting in an observation blind or watching from that remote view camera that we were looking at earlier, you can identify that a feeding is occurring, how often a feeding is occurring. You can certainly see how large the fish is. You can oftentimes identify the species of fish, at least generally. It's hard to do, especially when the birds are moving quickly. But this is what we do year after year in a fashion that's the same over time and also across the Gulf of Maine. There are other groups doing similar kinds of work at other colonies. We all try to collect these data in the same fashion so that we can be making comparisons to see changes over time and also understand more holistically changes throughout the Gulf of Maine. So this is the kind of data that we can get out of just the simple monitoring of the type of fish that the birds are eating. So what we have here is a graph. Each bar is 1 year of this study, and the y-axis is the proportion of any particular fish species. So, and I've got some photos of, or images of some of the most common fish species here on the right. We were already talking earlier about haddock and hake and pollock. Herring also is a primary, really important fish in the diet of these birds. It's the green bars here. So you can see there is change over time. We are excited to be exploring some of those patterns. One of the ones I want to talk to you about tonight is butterfish. So the butterfish is this pink bar on the top. Hopefully you can see it. And the trend is certainly increasing in the second decade of this two-decade data series. I'm going to dive a little bit more into this question about butterfish. Butterfish is a typically more warm water fish. Their center of their population is more in the mid-Atlantic. And this species is native to the Gulf of Maine, but as water temperatures are warming here, it's becoming more comfortable for those butterfish. They're moving, their population centers are moving north to the point where they're increasing here in the Gulf of Maine. And I know some of you have just arrived, but you may have already heard this news that the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 99% of the world's oceans. This is something we talk about a lot here. This makes the Gulf of Maine a really interesting place to study climate change. What we have on the right here is a graph of water temperature in the month of July, which is when these terns are trying to feed their chicks, over the span of the period of this data set that I want to share with you. So you can see this is a significant increase in just 20 years. And remember, we talked about the lifespan of these birds. These are long-lived birds. They can live 20 or 30 years. So what we're talking about is a pretty drastic change within the lifespan of a typical bird. So they are experiencing this in their own lifespan. Now here I have another graph. Instead of temperature over time, now we have temperature is on the x-axis. So as temperature is increasing, we see that on the y-axis, the proportion of butterfish in the diet is also increasing. So the earlier graph, you could see decadally, there's definitely more butterfish later years. What we find is a really strong relationship between temperature and the proportion of butterfish that terns are bringing in. And this is problematic because these butterfish are They're lovely little fish. They're very slim laterally, but dorsoventrally, they're very deep bodied. They look kind of like a goldfish cracker is what I compare them to. And because these birds, adults are feeding their chicks whole fish, they have to be able to get it through that gape limitation. And more often than not, these common terns cannot, the chicks and the adults cannot swallow the fish that that the adults are catching. So I want to share about the research that one of our undergraduate students, Olivia Smith, conducted. She was particularly interested in the implications of increasing butterfish in the diet on common tern chicks. And she wanted to quantify, like, yeah, I could say, you know, before we did this study, I could say, yeah, butterfish is not good fish for terns. It's a problem. But that's not a quantitative approach. We wanted to be able to quantify the suitability of butterfish relative to other fish. And so Olivia did that in two ways. The x-axis here are all those different categories of fish with butterfish on the left. And the top graph here, this is handling time. How many seconds it took. I know terns don't have hands, but handling time is a term in ecology. This is how long it takes for an animal to manipulate prey to the point where it's done manipulating it. And in our case, that means it's either swallowed it or it's given up or it's been stolen. And so what you can see here is that the amount of time it took for terns to handle that prey was significantly higher. And this is log scale. Can you see that? We're talking 1,000-fold here. So it took them significantly longer to manipulate that prey, meaning they're sitting trying to swallow it, like that tern in the photo, for some whole minutes. And despite that effort, on the lower graph here, you can see this is feeding success. So what proportion actually were successfully swallowed? And the butterfish is significantly lower than every other prey. So this is an energetic sink for these birds, for the parents who are going out and doing all that fishing, and for the chicks who are spending minutes trying to swallow that fish, and also potentially missing out on other meals that are coming in from the other parent in the meantime, which is something that we see. So what are the consequences for the chicks themselves? Here we have a graph that takes into account feeding rate on the x-axis, but proportion of butterfish is what you see on the y. And those darker colors are higher growth rates. So you can see that if you just look at butterfish, as you increase in the proportion of butterfish in the diet, the growth rate decreases. And you know, feeding rate has some impact on that. The more the bird is getting fed, the likelihood is it's getting fed some other things as well. It's kind of complicated, but that general trend is that with increasing proportions of butterfish, these chicks are growing less quickly. Some of them are even losing weight. Those birds will die. And we find that there's strong relationships between growth rates and survival in these chicks, and that chicks that survive are fed significantly less butterfish by their parents than chicks whose final disposition is dead. So these are critical issues for these birds. Interestingly, I didn't share this graph here, but Olivia looked at this at a nest level. So not just at the population level, but looking at the behavior of individual nests, two parents feeding their chicks, and found even in years where butterfish made up 30% of the diet at the colony level, some nests never fed their chicks butterfish at all. Some adults never brought in a butterfish, even if we watched 100 feedings. And so that's an interesting indication of perhaps learned behavior. We don't know exactly the mechanism for this. Are they just good at catching other fish, or are they avoiding butterfish? Lots of questions that we would love to answer that I think are really interesting about how potentially these birds are adapting to changes in the environment. This, to me, is an exciting sign of resiliency, hope for some resiliency in the face of what will probably be increasing butterfish into the future. So to wrap up, I want to just share a little bit about Olivia's experience. I met Olivia at the University of New Hampshire during her freshman seminar and encouraged her to come out and take field ornithology, which she did. After that, she did an independent study with me, a research internship in the summer, and then worked for 2 summers with me on White and Seavey Islands as a technician, and is off to really really great things with in Boston right now with the National Park Service. I think she might be surveying herons, probably not as we speak, but I hope she got to do that today. Olivia prepared an incredible paper. The figures that I showed you today are from that paper. She's the first author on that paper, and I'm very proud of her achievements here, what she's contributed to our understanding, and also how hopefully this work has helped her in her career. So that's one example, I think, of great success. Olivia, if you're out there, congratulations. I want to move on now from Olivia and talk a little bit more about other aspects of foraging ecology. So we know that terns are foraging to feed their young in this marine landscape that's currently, well, has been for a long time, and currently experiencing rapid growth in what we call the blue economy. We're talking about fishing industries, aquaculture, renewable energy, like offshore wind. So this map, don't even worry about the specifics. This is showing all the existing and planned aquaculture and offshore wind in our neighborhood, with that lower triangle being our location. So there's a lot going on, is the message I'm trying to get across here. But in order to assess the impacts of that growth, specifically on threatened and endangered species in particular, where there is some additional protection under the Endangered Species Act. So to understand those threats, and also conversely, to learn from the seabirds about commercially important fish stocks, we have to first understand how they're using the marine landscape. So that's the very first step, is where are they going? What habitats are they using? This information is really important for us to be able to compare spatially data about fish populations with seabird diet, and also look at risk, for instance, with overlap with renewable energy. So this work, this movement ecology work that I'm going to describe next, is largely being driven by Alia Caldwell. So she's the graduate student that prepared that really cool migration path that you saw. She's currently a PhD candidate in Dr. Nathan Fury's lab in the biology department at UNH. And she's been working since 2019. We've been putting out GPS tags on common terns, 10 to 20 per year, to better understand their movement ecology. And I'll explain to you a little bit more with some data. But you can see here, these are the tags that we've deployed on these common terns. We'll be putting out another 15 to 20 this summer. And this is a photo. You've seen it once before, but you might not have noticed that this is a bird wearing a GPS transmitter and feeding its chick a approximately 2 bill length herring. Okay, so here are some of the data that Alia has retrieved from the GPS tags. This is a map of our Gulf of Maine region. You can see here, this is, I hope you can see it, this is Cape Cod, and here's our location where these points are centered. And so Alia has used a hidden Markov modeling approach to determine different movement states. So she's got nesting states are in red. That's the bird kind of sitting on the colony. Transiting, obviously, and foraging. This is a bird that's probably slowed down, hopefully caught a fish, turned around, and coming back to feed that fish to its chick. So the model is able to pick up these differences. And Alia has left the locations of all those blue modeling results up there so that you can see the distribution of foraging locations and this is an example from 7 different individuals in the year 2021. So to put this in context, you can see these birds are going all the way down to Cape Cod. That's about 80 miles away. And we know, based on some of our observations in those blinds, watching these tagged birds come back, that a lot of them are coming back with fish, presumably that they caught on Cape Cod to feed their young. So these birds are traveling, at least in some years, very long distances. So here's 3 examples of foraging distributions that Alia has gleaned from these movements. So looking at the kernel density of those foraging locations. And what you can see is a lot of variability year to year. And when we compare this to the diet data, we find that in years when the population overall is bringing back a lot of really high quality fish, their forage, and that's what happened in 2022, for example. The foraging distances are much smaller. So they're not traveling very far from the colony in order to get a good fish in a year where forage fish are abundant. In years where those high quality foods are scarce, like in 2 examples of 2019 and 2021, these birds are traveling much farther from home to provision their chicks. So those long distance foraging trips really compound the energetic consequences of shifting foraging resources. Certainly, they tell us a lot about the areas that are really important to the terns that we might consider protecting. We are particularly interested in protecting as foraging grounds for terns. But also, this approach helps us define the spatial scale at which we can infer how the diet of the seabirds reflects fish communities. So we know that the diet that's coming into the colony in a particular year might reflect the fish community, let's say, just in the seacoast region from the Merrimack up to the Piscataqua in some years. But in other years, it might be reflecting this region more broadly. And so this is really helpful for people who want to use these data, like fisheries managers who are on our team, interested in using this really valuable information about how how seabird diets are changing over time to potentially reflect what's happening with fish stocks. These birds are eating young fish, age 0 or 1 year old, depending on the species. And those fish are maybe recruiting into the fishery 4 or 5 years later. So it's really valuable to get this preview of what's going to be happening with commercially important fish species down the road. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up by sharing some highlights. I'm going to go quickly through a sample of the diversity of research that some of the undergraduates are doing in our program, in addition to the example I gave from Olivia. This is not at all an exhausted list of all the research that's being done or all the student projects, so I wouldn't have time because there's so much amazing stuff that our students have done. But my goal here is to hopefully spark some interest amongst this group, particularly our field ornithology students, to get involved either in seabird research in our program or in other opportunities to do independent undergraduate research. That's my hope. So going quickly and briefly, I want to highlight some of the students working in each of these research areas. So in addition to the work that I shared from Olivia and the graduate work from Alia, in terms of diet and foraging behavior, we have a fantastic collaboration with Dr. Gemma Klukas at the Lab of Ornithology. Her Seabird Conservation Analytics team, and yes, that's SCAT, is doing a lot of poop collection and using a genomics approach to characterize seabird diets that way. And this has added a really cool new dimension and an incredible level of detail to our understanding of the taxonomic makeup of seabird diets. So we can tell now not just that it's a herring, but is it a river herring or an Atlantic herring? We just get a lot more information about the species diversity. It changes the number of species we might observe in a year from 5 or 6 to 10 to 20. And by understanding the specific fish species that are in the diets, we can then look into the natural history of those species and see, well, how do we predict that their populations are going to change moving forward with forecasted climate change? And what impacts will that have on these birds? So the context is super useful, just having that extra information, which we could not get any other way. So we have a number of undergraduates that are working both in Gemma's lab and out here at the Isles of Shoals, including Grace, who's going to be out as a Surge, a Shoals undergraduate researcher as part of our research group here. Patrick will be coming out for a couple of weeks. He's interested particularly in the microbiome of these birds. And Abby, who's one of our Surges last year and has been working on guillemot diets and is moving on to other senior thesis research. Okay, and so next is contaminants and microplastics. So Alia, who I mentioned already, actually joined our group earlier than any of the research that I just described. She came out here in 2018 as, again, as an undergraduate researcher looking at exposure of gulls and terns to plastic in the diet. and how foraging strategy and differences in foraging strategy between closely related species like herring gulls and blackback gulls or different species of terns impacts their plastic ingestion risk. So she's published 2 papers based on this undergraduate research, which we're incredibly proud of. And these are really powerful, highly cited papers. This is a quickly growing field, and they're based on our amazing birds here at Shoals. Another really cool project that we're doing right now is with Lenny. Lenny's just graduated from Dartmouth a year ago and came out also as a Shoals undergraduate researcher, interested in mercury burden in seabird species. And so Lenny is looking at mercury in a number of different seabirds, guillemots and terns, and comparing again mercury to aspects of their foraging ecology that we're learning about from stable isotope analysis. So Lenny has a paper in review. Way to go, Lenny. Next, adaptive management, adaptive habitat management. We've had a number of students working on these questions over the years. Rai was an undergraduate from the University of New Hampshire who explored habitat preferences of terns based on what we could observe of their reproductive success in different types of habitats. And there's Rai winning a poster award. Way to go, Rai. And also the SML's Coastal Habitat Field Research Methods class, which isn't being offered this year, but hopefully will come back. This one's led by Dr. Greg Moore at the University of New Hampshire. This class has contributed to our research on adaptive management techniques, where we're modifying habitat mostly through spraying salt, ideally in a way that would maximize tern reproductive output. And in order to understand how we might maximize tern reproductive output, we need to know which habitat types and what they look like and what's the density and height and different aspects of the vegetation that they prefer. So based on this information, like what we got from Rai, we have targets that we want to hit for habitat management. And that group has helped us with a publication on that. And we continue iteratively year after year to collect data on our habitat management, collect data on the response of the birds, and adapt moving forward. Again, to maximize reproductive output. The reason we have to do this is because terns bring a huge amount of nutrients into their environment through poop and dead nestlings, dead fish, lots of butterfish, and they are fertilizing these islands far more than they might be in a system where they were naturally moving around from island to island. I mentioned these are management dependent birds. We are managing this island for them. They can't really go anywhere else. And so it's also our job to make sure that this location that they are using is as optimal as possible for their reproductive success. Okay. And finally, investigator disturbance. So obviously, we physically are studying these birds in a lot of different ways. We are interacting with them. We are touching them. We are in their space. We are stressing them out by putting GPS tags on them. We know that there is potentially, there can be impacts of investigators on the study that they're on the system that they're studying. So we want to better understand what those impacts are, especially if they're negative on the animals or if they are impacting the metrics that we're actually trying to measure. So we've had 2 students looking at tag effects from the GPS tags. Beck Kupferberg is a UNH student who, this is just from our recent undergraduate research conference at UNH, where Bet was presenting her findings about common tern behavior for tagged and untagged birds, and finding no significant difference in their ability to raise chicks, for their chicks to grow, or even for the type of diet or the rate of feeding of tagged and untagged birds. This year, we're going to be starting a foray into tagging roseate terns, which is particularly important. This is an endangered species. Nobody really knows where they're going. And in the context of the blue economy growth, we need to be able to arm the industry and the Fish and Wildlife Service with real data that they can use to make decisions about where they want to put wind farms. So Grace will be out this summer helping with a tag effect study on roseate terns. Grace is one of the students from Cornell. Noah is one of our Shoals undergraduate researchers from last summer, and he was particularly interested in the guillemots that this group has been studying, and whether all the time that we spend trying to get a guillemot out of a deep, dark crevice has any negative impact on the chicks themselves, their growth, their parents' behavior in terms of feeding them. So he tried so hard to find an effect, and we were pleased that he did not find an effect of our activities on these birds. And then finally, Joe Brusso's the fellow on the right here. He's also one of our Seabird technicians this summer. So he's over on White Island right now. And this is a picture from him earlier this season. But Joe also was an undergraduate at the University of New Hampshire, working in Dr. Laura Klepper's lab, which does an amazing work with passive bioacoustics. That group is interested in mapping how the soundscape of the island corresponds with density and phonology of birds. And Joe was particularly interested in how investigator disturbance influenced that soundscape. Because we know when we walk into a colony, it gets really loud. Obviously, we're having this effect, but we need to know what the effect is and how sustained it is in order to interpret the data for any other uses, and also to understand our own impacts. So Joe's prepared a manuscript that's in review now that showed obviously an increase in sound as investigators approach, but also defined at what distance that amplitude came back down to normal. Okay, so that was a lot, I know. So obviously, I hope you have seen that our students are exploring a lot of different aspects of seabird ecology, lots of questions related to applied conservation and management here in the Isles of Shoals. And you might consider exploring something like this with us. So there's lots of ways to get involved. The first one you all have already done, at least the folks in this room are here. And this was one of the ways I mentioned that Olivia Smith got involved, took an ornithology class first, and really was interested and stayed involved, and we absolutely encourage that. You saw that as I went through a lot of those undergraduate research projects, most of them were independent research coming through our Shoals undergraduate research group. And so students who've taken a class at Shoals are very nicely set up to please apply and come back, spend a whole summer studying seabirds or any number of other things. We have 10 to a dozen students who'll come out and spend the whole summer here and get paid to do this kind of research in the summer. Please consider that in the future. And as I mentioned, I have Seabird technicians that I hire every summer that help us to conduct this, particularly the tern work. We are residential on White Island, doing the management, monitoring, and research. I hire 2 students every year. And as we grow and write grants and make new collaborations, we also try to find opportunities for graduate students and postdocs. So these are things to be thinking about. So I want to wrap it up again by just sharing my great appreciation for all of the students who are involved in this work, particularly the students who will be here this summer. If you interact with them at all, chat them up. We're all very keen. They are all very keen about the work that they're doing. With that, I will stop. This is my contact information. You can find us on the Shoals Marine Lab website as well. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes for questions. So if anyone has questions, I'll bring the microphone around. And do you have any online yet?
Hi, I was curious if you knew like the movement ecology. You were talking about how the terns go all the way down to like Cape Cod. I was curious if you knew if all the terns that were coming from like Massachusetts were from this colony, or if there is any other tern colonies around the area.
And since you got the microphone, can they hear on Zoom as well? Yes, okay, great. So I won't repeat the question, but there are tern colonies up and down the coast here. So if you're seeing a tern in the Piscataqua River, like as we're coming out to Shoals, that is highly likely a tern that's breeding here. Down in Cape Cod, there are colonies. Monomoy Island, I believe, is actually no longer the largest tern colony in the world, but there are 10,000 terns that nest in colonies on Cape Cod. And then further south from there in Massachusetts, Bird and Ram Islands, I believe it's Bird Island, that's the largest tern colony in the world. So the fact that our birds are going down there probably means something good is happening down in the Cape with fish. And we also know that our terns, after the breeding season is over, I don't think, well, we can see if it'll come up in the, we'll see if this plays again. After the breeding season, our birds spend a lot of time in Cape Cod teaching their chicks how to fish and fattening up their chicks before doing their southern migration. So that's a hub for birds throughout the region. Good question, thank you.
Have you done any research or looked at possible connections or effects of Calanus finmarchus and its deal in the Gulf of Maine with terns?
Yeah, we've focused more on fish, on small bait fish. And so my group has not, but I'd have to look and see if any of the other historic studies have looked at that as an indication of the base of the food web, which I think would be a really interesting thing to look at. Yeah.
Oh, wow, this is loud.
I know.
So the tern colonies around here, you mentioned they're management dependent. Is that like also seen in the other colonies like along the Gulf? And like, if so, if they are like, if they're all the colonies are management dependent, like, why are they now like compared to like I guess earlier years?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And it's the one we get all the time, especially from, let's say, the state that's putting up a lot of money to do this kind of work year after year. Taxpayer money goes into putting people on these islands year after year. What's the exit strategy? Why are we doing this? Part of it, really all of it comes back to a combination of natural history and human history. So the natural history is that these birds are arriving late in comparison to other birds, and so they are being outcompeted. You asked if it's just here or more broadly. When I was just starting off as a graduate student, I went to a conference, the Northeast Natural History Conference, and there was a symposium on terns. And I had been working on one tern colony. It was the first time I'd ever worked with terns, didn't know anything else really about terns. And I was blown away to hear stories from people from the Gulf of Maine all the way through the Great Lakes, telling the same stories about management, about what happens when management lapses, when it changes hands. And what happens is other competitors move in, seabirds like terns blink out. And so it is an active decision, a choice, an investment to maintain this biodiversity in this way. And what's happened is largely those natural, what we call metapopulation dynamics. These are bird populations spread over multiple islands and interchanging individuals from year to year. And in a system that had many islands to choose from that these birds could move around to, a colony location could blink off in one place and blink back on in another. Let's say a predator came or a competitor, they'd go somewhere else. And so what we're dealing with is now a landscape where it's pretty crowded because of competition with other species, gulls included, which have increased in population if we're talking about hundreds of years, subsidized to some extent by human populations. There's more competitors and fewer places to go. Just look at the Isles of Shoals themselves. There's not a lot of locations here where you don't find human occupation, human habitation, or gulls and cormorants. There's only one place, and it's White and Seavey, and it's because we actively make a point of that. Yeah.
We do have a couple of online questions. Becky
Thank you.
is asking, has the super saline spray worked to decrease vegetation in the colonies?
Yeah, so people have tried all kinds of things to keep vegetation from growing, and vegetation likes to grow when it's really nicely fertilized, and all these islands are nicely fertilized. So there's the whole community has invested in all different kinds of techniques. We were interested in salt because it could enhance a natural process of vegetative suppression. So if you look at the ecology of any shoreline, you can see as you get further away from the ocean, from that effect of salt, the vegetative community changes. We wanted to make it feel a little bit more like these birds were, these plants were in the intertidal. And so hypersaline spray has worked. It works better in drier years. The effect is stronger. It's a bit more diluted, literally, in years when it's really wet. But we see significant decreases in the percent cover of plants and the height of vegetation, both of which are important indicators for tern preferences of habitat. And we also find that we increase the nesting density in those areas that we treat relative to control areas. So it has worked. We've actually found we don't even need to spray it. We actually can just sift it onto the environment, which is lighter than using water. Plain old seawater at normal salinity is not enough to have a strong effect. We have to add a lot of salt, but we do add a lot of salt and it works really nicely. We've been able to, it's particularly effective on grasses, and we have a lot of grassy areas that neither the roseate tern or the common terns are using. And so we're trying to make it better for common terns, which like that open space. We're managing for both common and roseate terns here. Even though roseate terns actually like dense vegetation, they need a healthy common tern population to nest alongside. You do not see roseate tern colonies in a vacuum. They are not single species colonies of roseate terns. They are relying likely on some of the protection that they get from common terns, which are a bit more aggressive. Granted, they have to compete with them for food and space, but they choose to nest alongside one another. So we can't just have the whole island be perfect for roseate terns. We have to manage for both.
Thank you, Liz. And Lindsay is asking, has any correlation been observed between foraging distance and or direction and fish prey species brought back to the colony?
We haven't conducted the study in that way yet. Alia has looked at the population level and found that in years when tern foraging distances are farther, when they're traveling further away, we're also seeing more invertebrates in the diet. That doesn't mean they're necessarily traveling further to get an invertebrate. It just means that on the whole, what's most abundant around the colony is invertebrates, and these birds are traveling further and further to get what fish they can find. So one of the next steps we want to do is to look at specifically which fish the birds are bringing back, pair that with the location and distance that they've traveled. This is something that takes a pretty large sample size, and as you can imagine, it takes a lot of time to collect those data. So we're getting to the point where we have a good number of observations, and we're also collaborating with the National Audubon Society Seabird Institute, Project Puffin, folks from Maine Coastal Islands National Wildlife Refuge, who are also deploying these tags, who are also monitoring the diet, and collectively we will hopefully be able to answer some of those questions with a larger sample size.
So with that, I'm going to thank Dr. Craig for a wonderful first Rock Talk of the season, and say I think that this has done a great job of really highlighting what Shoals does in mentoring students, primarily undergrads, but often throughout a tremendous amount of their career. And to thank her for spending so much time working on such an important group. For those of you that are in field ornithology, you'll have the chance to talk with her again later when you get a chance to visit at White. So think about if you have any other questions. And then last but not least, I'd like to present Liz with a small memento of her first Rock Talk.
Oh, it's lovely. Oh my. This is White Island Light. This is our home sweet home. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you, guys. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing.
For any of you on Zoom, please join us every Tuesday from now until mid-August, 8 o'clock on Tuesdays. We continue to have the Rock Talk series, and we look forward to next week's Rock Talk as well. Thank you for joining us.